Long before Alexander's boots ever touched the sands of Egypt, the desert already knew he was coming. It was a time of silence and waiting. Beneath the golden sun and between the shifting dunes, whispers moved like wind across the Nile. Rumors of a boy king from the north who had shattered Persia's invincibility at Issus and marched without hesitation through Phoenicia and Gaza. To the people of Egypt, tired of foreign rule and the heavy yoke of the Persian Empire, these were not just whispers. They were prayers. Desperate, half-formed hopes that a liberator might rise, not from within, but from beyond. Egypt, the gift of the Nile, had endured invasions and dynasties. It had been ruled by pharaohs, priests, warlords, and conquerors. But never before had the gods felt so distant. The temples at Thebes no longer sang with daily offerings. Memphis, once radiant with gold and ceremony, now stood quiet under the watchful eyes of Persian satraps. And yet, even in silence, the land remembered. It remembered the rhythm of divine kingship, the covenant between God and ruler, and it awaited a new name to inscribe into that sacred lineage. For nearly 2 centuries, Egypt had been passed back and forth between empires like a trophy. The Persians, led by Cambyses and later Darius and Xerxes, had not been gentle masters. Taxes bled the villages dry. Temples were desecrated. The language of the conquerors echoed through the courts while native tongues faded into the walls. The gods, once fed with incense and praise, were now honored in whispers, secretly, desperately. Rebellions rose and were crushed. Hopes flared and were extinguished. A once mighty civilization lived now in fragments, surviving not through pride but through memory. And yet, not all was lost. Along the Nile, where farmers still coaxed life from the mud and merchants still carried papyrus downriver, there lingered the resilience of old Egypt. In the sacred halls of Karnak and the hidden chambers of Siwa, priests whispered over scrolls older than empires. They watched the stars. They consulted omens. And what they saw startled them. A lion rising in the west. A great storm forming, yet with a center of calm. A youth with the breath of Ammonius in his lungs and the fire of Are in his gaze. Signs, so many signs, that the gods had not forgotten their people. They had only been waiting. In the shadows of these prophecies, a name began to spread. Not in the tongues of the priests, but in the rough voices of soldiers, traders, and slaves. Alexander. He was young, younger than the priests had expected. But his victories were ancient in scale. They said he did not walk like a mortal, but with the stride of Achilles and the eyes of Zeus. They said he spoke to the wind and the sea obeyed him. That he had tamed the horse Bucephalus with a whisper, not a whip. That he had never lost a battle. That even the Persians, who once mocked his youth, now fled at the sight of his banners. And now, he was coming. From Gaza, he would march along the edge of the Sinai, a cruel stretch of sun and stone where armies withered and even camels faltered. But he came not in desperation, nor in conquest alone. He came with purpose. He came with dreams. He came with something the Persians never brought, reverence. In Memphis, satrap Mazak sat in uneasy silence. He had no army to match Alexander's. Darius, busy in the east, sent no reinforcements. And the people, those quiet, watchful people of Egypt, offered no loyalty. Mazak knew the tide had turned. But he could not yet see the wave that approached. Alexander's arrival was not heralded by war cries or siege engines. It was foretold by silence. The kind of silence that comes when a storm is near. Along the coast, fishermen stopped casting their nets and stared northward. In the cities, scribes paused mid-sentence. Even the ibis, sacred bird of Thoth, took flight inland as if guided by unseen forces. And then, on a day scorched by sun and swept with dust, the horizon shifted. Helmets glinted. Horses stamped. Spears shimmered like reeds. And at the head of it all, astride a stallion black as midnight, rode the man who would change Egypt forever. Alexander of Macedon. He did not enter Egypt like a conqueror. He entered as if he were returning home. No sword was raised against him. No gates were barred. Mazak surrendered without a fight, offering the keys of Memphis with trembling hands and averted eyes. But it was not to Mazak that the people looked. They looked to Alexander. And Alexander, calm, composed, radiant in his armor, looked back. Not with arrogance, but with a strange, knowing familiarity. As if the temples had already whispered his name to him. As if the Nile had spoken to him in dreams. As if Egypt had called, and he had answered. He dismounted. He walked the causeways of Memphis. He listened to the priests. He made offerings to Apis, the sacred bull. And when he raised his hands to the heavens, it was not in the manner of a foreign god, but in the old, sacred gesture of a pharaoh. Something ancient stirred. For the first time in generations, the people felt a breeze not of the desert, but of change. The air tasted not of dust, but of prophecy. The boy from Macedon had come, not as an invader, but as something older, something foretold, something divine. Before he was a god in Egypt, he was a boy in Macedonia, restless, brilliant, and burning with a hunger that no map could contain. Alexander, son of Philip II of Macedon and Olympias of Epirus, was not born to be ordinary. From his earliest days he was caught between the mortal and the mythic. His mother whispered to him that he was descended from Achilles on one side and Heracles on the other. His father shaped him into a warrior, but it was a philosopher who gave him vision. As a teenager, Alexander sat beneath the shade of a Macedonian grove and studied under Aristotle. Where other princes learned only of war and governance, Alexander devoured the works of Homer, Herodotus, and Plato. He questioned the stars, memorized the histories of fallen kingdoms, and debated the nature of courage and justice. He didn't just want to rule. He wanted to understand, to grasp the order of the world and his place within it. But understanding the world was never enough. He wanted to change it. When Philip was assassinated, the boy became king, just 20 years old, newly crowned and already surrounded by rivals. Many thought Macedon would crumble without Philip's iron hand. But they had not yet seen Alexander's fire. Within a year, he crushed rebellions in Greece, securing his throne with precision and fury. Then he turned eastward, toward Persia. The great empire of Darius III was the largest the world had ever seen. Its borders stretched from the Aegean to the Indus Tree. Its armies were vast, its wealth unimaginable. Yet Alexander, with only 40,000 men, crossed into Asia with no hesitation. It began at the river Granicus, where Persian satraps underestimated him, and died for it. Then came Issus, where Alexander faced Darius himself and routed the mighty Persian host, forcing the king to flee the battlefield and leaving his family captured. The young Macedonian could have taken their lives. Instead, he showed them dignity. To Alexander, the glory of victory came not from cruelty, but from honor, an idea he carried like a banner through every conquest. From there, he moved south along the Levantine coast. Tyre resisted. He laid siege for 7 months, building a causeway across the sea itself to reach the island fortress. When it fell, the world gasped. Gaza stood in his way next. It too crumbled. Now only one path remained, south into Egypt. But Alexander was not just chasing the collapse of Persia. He was chasing something more ancient, something he felt in his bones but could not yet name. He had read of the great pharaohs. He had imagined the Nile in his childhood dreams. Egypt was more than a stepping stone in a military campaign. To Alexander, Egypt was destiny. As his army camped on the edge of Sinai, the desert winds carried memories of empires past. He sat beneath the stars and watched the constellations the same way Egyptian priests had done for millennia. He spoke to his generals of monuments yet unbuilt. He spoke of a city, new, radiant, eternal. A city named after himself, founded in the sands but reaching toward the heavens. His men, grizzled veterans of years of warfare, followed him not just out of loyalty, but out of awe. They saw in him something impossible to explain. He was not the largest, nor the strongest. But when he entered a room, it changed. When he spoke, storms seemed to pause. He fought at the front lines, took wounds beside them, and demanded no comforts that his men did not share. Yet there was something distant in him, too, as if part of him was already beyond the world. He did not conquer like other kings. He inspired like a myth reborn. As they approached the Egyptian border, scouts reported that the Persian satrap Mazax had no army to stop them. Darius had sent no reinforcements. Egypt, weary of Persian rule, would offer no resistance. But still, Alexander prepared his men. He ordered no looting. No temples were to be touched. "This land," he said, "is older than our gods. It will greet us not with war, but with judgment." What no one knew, not even Alexander, was that Egypt had already begun to accept him. Priests in Memphis had read omens in the stars. They whispered of a son of Ammoniasare, born in a distant land, who would come to restore balance. The Oracle of Siwa had stirred from its long silence. And in the marketplaces and river villages stories spread of a golden-haired warrior who rode with lions at his side, who crossed mountains as easily as rivers, who never lost a battle and bore no fear. To the Egyptians, Alexander did not come as a foreigner. He came as fulfillment. But Alexander did not yet understand the weight of what he was becoming. He still believed he was a Macedonian king, a commander of men, a master of tactics and terrain. He did not yet see himself as divine. That would come later, in the sand-swept solitude of Siwa. For now, he rode at the front of his army, his cloak snapping in the wind, his eyes fixed south. In his mind, Egypt shimmered like a mirage, a land of wisdom and secrets, gods and shadows, pyramids and promise. He did not know what he would find there, but he knew it would change him. He had crossed mountains, crushed cities, and defied empires. Now Alexander would cross a desert, and step into the oldest dream of all. The march across the Sinai was not the blood-soaked trail of conquest that had marked Alexander's earlier campaigns. It was different, quieter, as if the land itself had exhaled in relief. The desert was no easy companion. The sun punished without mercy. Water was precious, and wind turned even sand into blades. Yet through it all, Alexander's army pressed forward, disciplined, patient, and strangely expectant. They were marching not into battle, but into history. By the time the Nile's green fingers began to appear on the horizon, Alexander's arrival was not a surprise. Word of him had moved faster than any scout. Whispers had crossed rivers and city gates. In Memphis, in Heliopolis, even in the far temples of Thebes, they already knew the young lion of Macedon was coming. But no one picked up a sword. Not a single archer climbed the walls. Not a single gate was barred. Alexander the Great was about to conquer Egypt, and not a single arrow would be fired. The surrender at Memphis. Mazax, the Persian satrap of Egypt, sat in the governor's palace in Memphis and weighed the impossible. He had no reinforcements. Darius had abandoned him, preoccupied with gathering shattered armies to the east. The Egyptian people, long resentful of Persian rule, had no loyalty left to offer. Mazax could either resist and be crushed, or yield and preserve what dignity remained. He chose the latter. When Alexander approached the city gates, he found them already open. The Nile shimmered behind them, its calm waters a mirror to the sky. Soldiers stood aside. The people gathered not in fear, but in silence. And Mazax, dressed not for war but in ceremonial robes, stepped forward and surrendered Egypt without a fight. He offered Alexander the satrap's seal, the treasury, and the city itself. But Alexander asked for more. He asked for respect, for the gods, the temples, and the people. "I did not come to plunder," he said. "I came to honor what is eternal." Mazax bowed. In that moment, Egypt changed hands, not through violence, but through reverence. The procession of a stranger pharaoh. Memphis erupted, not in resistance, but in celebration. Priests came forward in white linen, bearing incense and hymns. Sacred bulls were led through the streets. Women wove laurel and lotus into garlands. The temples, silent for so long under Persian rule, were suddenly filled with chanting again. Alexander did not demand these rituals. The Egyptians offered them willingly. They saw in him not just a new ruler, but a possible pharaoh, a living bridge between God and earth, as their ancient tradition demanded. He did not reject the honor. He accepted it with solemnity, with a posture not of conquest but of communion. At the temple of Ptah, he offered sacrifice to Apis, the sacred bull, an act that stunned the priesthood, for here was a foreign king who understood the gods of Egypt. Not as conqueror, as believer. To the people watching, this was no longer a Greek commander. This was something else entirely. A figure shaped by prophecy. Perhaps even by the gods themselves. An army held in reverence. For Alexander's men, veterans of battles from Illyria to Issus, this new form of conquest was uncanny. There were no siege towers, no clashing shields, no shrieking cavalry charges. Only processions and perfumed temples. The army was received as heroes, not invaders. Local markets reopened. Provisions were offered freely. Egyptian craftsmen refitted Greek armor. Priests blessed the regiments before the next stage of their campaign had even begun. Some Macedonians joked that Egypt had been waiting for them all along. Others, more reflective, began to wonder if Alexander truly was more than a man. "Not even the gods fight against him," one soldier whispered. "Perhaps because he walks among them." The Nile sees a new future. The Nile flowed on, eternal and indifferent. But the cities along its banks, Memphis, Sais, Heliopolis, began to stir from their Persian-imposed slumber. Alexander moved with grace between them, careful to show respect. Where Darius had imposed tribute, Alexander lowered burdens. Where Persian officials had desecrated temples, Alexander restored them. He met with Egyptian nobles, not to command, but to listen. He brought translators and philosophers to his meetings, not just generals. He asked about their calendar, their gods, their floods, their stars. He even began to adopt local symbols, blending them with his own. In his seals, Greek laurels now shared space with Egyptian inks. Macedonian lions stood beside Horus falcons. It was not assimilation. It was transformation. A kingdom won without battle. In the great stone court of the Memphis temple complex, an aged priest approached Alexander. His eyes were cloudy with age, but his voice rang clear. "You came with no sword," he said. "Yet you cut away the chains of our silence. The Nile has seen many rulers, but not all are remembered. Only those who honored her." Alexander did not reply. Instead, he reached down, gathered a handful of Nile water in his hands, and let it flow back through his fingers. Perhaps he understood something few others did. that true conquest is not of land, but of the heart. Toward the horizon, the conquest of Egypt, so bloodless yet so profound, was only the beginning. Alexander stood now at a crossroads, not just in geography, but in spirit. He had entered Egypt as a king of men, but the land had begun to shape him into something more. A god? A liberator? A bridge between worlds? Even he did not yet know. But the journey was not finished. In his dreams now, a voice whispered through the desert wind. A name spoken on sacred sands. Siwa. A place where even pharaohs sought answers. And Alexander would go there, not to conquer, but to discover. The conquest of Egypt had been effortless, almost sacred, like opening a long-sealed tomb without disturbing a single grain of sand. But Alexander sensed that he had only touched the surface. Beneath the applause of crowds and the rituals of priests lay something deeper, a pulse as old as the stars. It beat in the Nile. It whispered from the statues. It echoed through the columns of ruined temples. If he was to truly rule this land, not by force, but by spirit, he would have to understand it. And so Alexander, the world's greatest warrior, began to study like a student again. A king among scribes and priests. In the temple libraries of Heliopolis, he sat with Egypt's most ancient scholars, men who measured time not in years, but in floods and dynasties. They explained the concept of Ma'at, the divine order of truth, balance, and justice. A pharaoh's true duty, they said, was not conquest. It was balance, between gods and men, desert and river, life and death. Alexander listened, fascinated. The Greek world spoke of order through reason. Egypt spoke of it through ritual and myth. Yet in both systems he saw patterns, parallels, unity. He asked questions that stunned his hosts. What does the soul weigh at death? Why do the gods hide themselves? Does the Nile rise because the gods permit it, or because the stars decree it? They had never heard such questions from a conqueror. He was unlike any ruler Egypt had ever known. Visions along the river. Alexander traveled south along the Nile, moving not as a general, but as a pilgrim. He passed cities whose names were older than the Greek alphabet, Abydos, where Osiris was said to have died, Dendera, where Hathor's temple whispered of joy and rebirth. The further he journeyed, the more he transformed. He no longer spoke of Darius or Persia. He spoke of destiny. In Thebes, beneath the broken gaze of the colossal seated statues of Amenhotep III, Alexander stood in silence for hours. His generals grew restless, but he ignored them. At sunset he turned to them and said, "These kings, they built for eternity. I fight battles, but they fought time itself." He began to speak more often in riddles, in poetry. It unsettled Ptolemy, his close companion. "The Nile has changed you," he said. Alexander replied, "No. It has revealed me." Whispers of the Oracle. Soon, word reached him from the western desert. The Oracle of Ammonius at Siwa Oasis had spoken of him before his arrival. There, it was said, a sacred spring flowed beneath palm trees and date groves, guarded by ancient priests. Only the greatest rulers, true sons of the gods, were granted answers there. The priests of Thebes confirmed the tale. "Ammonius has waited," they said. "He may call to you." That night, Alexander did not sleep. He paced beneath the stars. He had crossed the known world, crushed the might of Persia, and stood unopposed, but something remained unfinished. The silence within him was louder than ever. The Greeks called him a king, the Egyptians a pharaoh. But deep down, Alexander sought something more eternal, validation from the divine. And he was willing to cross the desert to find it. Dreams in stone and water. Before leaving Memphis for the western desert, Alexander commissioned his architects and urban planners to begin sketching a new city, Alexandria, where the Nile met the sea. It would be a place of fusion, Greek symmetry and Egyptian divinity, learning and trade, temples and harbors. But it would be more than a city. It would be his offering. A monument not to war, but to civilization. Then, in a moment that left his entourage in stunned silence, Alexander entered the sacred chamber of the Apis bull once more. This time, he placed both hands upon the animal's head, closed his eyes, and whispered something in Greek that no one else could hear. Later, a priest said, he did not pray. He made a promise. Between two worlds. As the preparations for the desert journey began, the Egyptian people continued to offer their new pharaoh reverence, not out of fear, but from belief. They painted his face on temple walls, alongside Ra and Osiris. They carved his name into cartouches, not in Greek, but in the sacred script of hieroglyphs. He had entered Egypt as a foreigner. He was leaving Memphis as something else. Something in between. Not quite man. Not yet God. In the silence of the night, as his caravan of camels and guides gathered at the edge of the Libyan desert, Alexander stood alone, gazing westward. The sands stretched endlessly, shimmering under the starlight. Somewhere beyond them lay Siwa, and he answered to a question he had never spoken aloud. Who or what was he? The desert was not like the battlefield. There were no enemy banners, no charging horses, no horns, no cries, no swords drawn, only silence and sand. Alexander stood at the edge of the Libyan desert, staring west into nothingness. Behind him, the Nile still whispered the songs of Egypt. Ahead, there was only the whisper of the unknown. Somewhere out there, hidden in an oasis guarded by the sky and scorched by sun, stood the Oracle of Siwa, where gods had once spoken and kings had once begged for truth. He did not come for strategy. He came for identity. He wanted to know who he was, not as a general, not as a king, but as something deeper, as something eternal. The journey begins. The caravan moved at dawn. Alexander brought a small entourage, priests, guides, translators, and a few close companions, including Ptolemy, who had been with him since youth. They rode camels and horses, carrying water, grain, offerings, and tools for survival. A wrong turn meant death. The desert offered no forgiveness. The sun struck them like a hammer. Wind carried sand like knives. Their skin cracked. Their lips bled. The heat bent the air into mirages, and even seasoned soldiers began to see ghosts. On the second day, a storm swallowed the sky. Their guides panicked, landmarks vanished, and the sun was hidden behind clouds of swirling grit. For hours they wandered. It was said no man had crossed this part of the desert without losing his way. Then something happened. A pair of ravens appeared, black as obsidian, circling high above. The soldiers watched them. They did not flee. They flew in a direction, calmly, purposefully. Alexander, lips sunburnt and hands blistered, raised his arm and pointed. Follow them. The ravens led them to water. A spring. A small grove. Life. The men wept. Even the guides were silent with awe. Birds sent by the gods, one priest whispered. Or by someone older, another said. Alexander said nothing, but in his eyes something flickered, recognition, as if he expected it. The land of the Oracle. On the fifth day, they crested a dune and saw it at last. Siwa. An oasis wrapped in palms, shielded by sandstone cliffs and sacred silence. A lake glimmered in its heart. Beyond it rose the temple of Ammonius, ancient even by Egyptian standards, its walls etched with prayers, its roof open to the stars. The priests of Siwa awaited him. They had seen no messengers, but they knew he was coming. "It was written," one said. "He walks with the voice of Ra." Alexander dismounted. He approached barefoot, unarmed, his armor left behind. He carried only a small gift of incense and a golden medallion shaped like the sun. As he entered the temple, the wind died. Even time seemed to pause. The question, what happened inside the oracle's chamber, has never been fully known. No historian, not Ptolemy, not Arrian, not Curtius, recorded the full exchange. Only hints. Only rumors. Alexander stood before the high priest, who wore a leopard skin and a crown of reeds. They spoke in hushed tones, beneath the image of Ammonius Ra, the ram-headed god of creation and kingship. Some said, Alexander asked, "Have I avenged my father?" Others claimed he asked, "Will I rule the world?" But the most enduring rumor, the one he never denied, was this: "Tell me the truth, am I the son of a god?" The high priest, after long silence, is said to have answered with one word in Egyptian: "Yes." The silence that followed. When Alexander emerged from the temple, his face was unreadable. His men stepped back. Even Ptolemy dared not speak. The air around him had changed. He walked slower now, as if the wind itself bowed to him. He spoke gently, carefully, like a man suddenly carrying something fragile, something invisible and sacred. Later, one soldier asked him what he had heard. Alexander replied only, "The god greeted me as his son." No one dared to ask again. Legacy in the sand. He remained in Siwa for 2 more days, receiving blessings, making offerings, and watching the stars from the temple's rooftop. The priests gave him new robes, lined with gold. They whispered old names, traced the shape of Ra's eye on his forehead, and marked him not as a foreigner, but as divine pharaoh. Then, without ceremony, he left. Back into the desert. Back toward Memphis. But he did not return the same. He had crossed the sea of death and emerged not just alive, but reborn. Not as Alexander, son of Philip, but as Alexander, son of Ammonius. He returned from the desert with sunburnt skin and sand-cracked lips, but there was something else, a stillness behind his eyes, a calm no battlefield had ever given him. The desert had not broken him. It had answered him. And now, Alexander was no longer just a conqueror. He was a man touched by gods, or perhaps something more. The caravan moved slowly back toward Memphis. The camels trudged through sand with heads bowed. The soldiers were quieter now. Even the most hardened Macedonian veterans watched their king with a mix of awe and confusion. He had always been bold. But now, there was mystery in him. He said little, but when he did, his voice carried like prophecy. When he saw the green edge of the Nile again, something inside him shifted. He had gone far to find the truth. Now, it was time to use it. A new kind of king. The priests greeted him with incense and prayers. Crowds gathered not in fear, but in reverence. At the great temple of Ptah in Memphis, Alexander walked alone into the sanctuary and placed a gift upon the altar, not a weapon, but a scroll. A message in Greek, wrapped in linen. The priest unwrapped it. It was a declaration, written in Alexander's own hand. "I am not here to erase. I am here to add." He meant every word. He would not replace Egypt's gods. He would stand beside them. He would not burn Egypt's temples. He would speak in them. The Greeks would call him king. The Egyptians would call him pharaoh. He would be both. Not because he pretended. Because he believed. The pharaoh's ritual. In a ceremony unseen for generations, Alexander allowed himself to be crowned as pharaoh in the ancient way. He stood barefoot on the sacred earth. The priests anointed him with oils. They placed the double crown on his head, the red crown of Lower Egypt, the white crown of Upper Egypt. They gave him the crook and flail, symbols of protection and justice. He raised his hands to the sun, not as a Greek warlord, but as the living Nisibidi, he of the sedge and bee, ruler of two lands. The people cheered. But what surprised them most was that when he addressed them, he did so not in Greek. He had learned enough of their tongue to speak the first few lines in Egyptian. His pronunciation was clumsy, but his intent was clear. "You are my people. Your gods are my gods. Your land is my home." In that moment, a bond was forged. Not of politics. Of faith. The scholars and the city. With his identity now transformed, Alexander turned his mind toward legacy. He summoned builders, architects, philosophers, and astronomers. He gathered them near the Mediterranean coast, at a small fishing village called Rhodotis. He pointed to the sea, to the marshes, to the distant white waves crashing against rocks. "Here," he said, "we will build the city that never forgets." The foundations of Alexandria were laid not by generals, but by thinkers. The grid plan came from Greek logic, the harbor from Phoenician expertise. The lighthouse, which would one day rise like a flame over the sea, was already imagined. And the great library, though still a dream, was seated in this moment. The city would reflect what Alexander had become. A blend. A bridge. A place where Egyptian priests, Greek poets, and Persian scholars could walk the same streets. Not a monument to his power. A vessel for his vision. Reactions from the Greeks. News of Alexander's transformation began to spread across the empire. In Macedon, some nobles were troubled. They heard tales of him dressed in linen, offering incense to animal gods, calling himself the son of Ammonius. "Has he gone mad?" one general whispered. "Or has he found something we refuse to see?" replied another. Even Aristotle, his former tutor, was said to have grown uneasy. The boy he once taught had become a man who listened to priests and built temples. But Alexander did not seek approval. He had seen something in Siwa. Something the logic of the Lyceum could not explain. He was no longer seeking to be remembered by scholars. He was shaping himself into a legend. The final acts in Egypt. Before leaving the Nile Valley, Alexander issued several commands. He ordered repairs to temples desecrated by Persian governors. He exempted certain priesthoods from tribute. He sent envoys deep into Nubia, inviting southern rulers to come north not for war, but for peace. He met with astronomers and mathematicians. He asked questions about the stars, the floods, the geometry of the pyramids. He funded local schools, and placed Egyptians in key administrative roles. He was not just visiting Egypt. He was binding it to him. A farewell without end. When it was finally time to depart for the east, to continue his conquest of Persia, Alexander stood again on the banks of the Nile. He looked down at the river, the same one he had first seen as a foreigner. Its waters flowed as they had for thousands of years, silent and wise. "I will return," he said softly. But history would deny him that chance. Though his bones would never rest in Macedon, Egypt would never forget him. Even centuries later, long after his empire had crumbled, Egyptians still told stories of the pharaoh who spoke Greek, the king who rode the sun, the stranger who came not to conquer, but to listen. And in the walls of Alexandria's oldest ruins, in fragments of temple stone and faded scrolls, his name would endure, not as an outsider, but as one of their own. The sun rose slowly over the Nile, casting long gold streaks across the waters. The city of Memphis stirred with morning prayers. But Alexander was already awake. His armor gleamed faintly in the light, though he wore it differently now, like a memory instead of a mantle. The desert, the priests, the oracle, they had all marked him. But the world beyond Egypt had not paused. Darius still lived. The Persian Empire still breathed. And destiny, that invisible chariot that had carried him across continents, whispered that his greatest test was still to come. The departure. As he boarded his ship at the port of Pelusium, a strange hush fell upon the soldiers and citizens who gathered to see him off. Many Egyptians watched with reverence, some throwing lotus flowers into the river. They did not shout or cheer. They stood silently, hands to their hearts, as the pharaoh departed. Alexander said nothing until the coastline faded. Then, as the waves of the Mediterranean rocked the vessel gently, he turned to Ptolemy. "Egypt was not a conquest," he said. "It was a conversation." Ptolemy nodded. "And what did it tell you?" "That empires crumble, but beliefs endure." The call of war. By the time they landed in Phoenicia, the world had shifted again. News came swiftly. Darius had regrouped. The Persians were preparing another force. The eastern satraps were uncertain, but not broken. They believed Alexander had become soft in Egypt, too comfortable with temples and titles. Alexander smiled when he heard it. Let them believe that. He began to move quickly, through Gaza, then north to Tyre, where his past siege had left the city still rebuilding. The scars were visible, but so was his legacy. Even now, the cities he had broken were beginning to reflect him. He pressed onward, rejoining his main army, now numbering over 40,000 men. Veterans from Issus and Tyre met him with cheers, though some whispered behind their hands about the strange Egyptian garb he had worn. Others were more concerned about his silence. He no longer boasted, no longer shouted his ambitions. But when he looked at them, they followed. A change in the king. In the weeks that followed, his generals noticed changes. He no longer held long banquets. He spent his nights studying maps, or walking alone beneath the stars. He prayed at dusk, not to Zeus, but in private, to something nameless. He began to merge rituals, pouring Greek wine into the earth, then raising his hands in Egyptian fashion. To many, it was unsettling. To Alexander, it was necessary. He was no longer just a Greek king. He was building something far stranger, a unity of minds, myths, and lands. Persia would not be conquered by the sword alone. It had to be absorbed. And he would be the vessel. Echoes of resistance. But the East would not surrender quietly. In Babylon and Persepolis, spies reported unrest. Darius had begun to speak again, not just as a king, but as a martyr in waiting. He painted Alexander as a foreign monster, a defiler of Zoroastrian fire temples, a man who wore false crowns. Alexander didn't flinch. "I am not his enemy," he told his inner circle. "I am his replacement." But war was not far. The next confrontation would be massive, greater than Issus, larger than any battle he had faced. And yet, he approached it not with hunger, but with precision. He gathered new troops from Phoenicia, supplies from Cyprus, even elephants from the east. But his greatest weapon was not in his army. It was in his image. Letters and shadows. Before marching east, Alexander did something unexpected. He wrote letters, not to kings, but to priests, governors, and satraps in Persian-controlled territories. He did not threaten them. He invited them. "Come," he wrote. "See how I rule. I destroy tyranny. I raise temples. I preserve what you built, and free it from fear." Some answered. Others hesitated. But the effect was clear. Cracks were forming in the Persian wall, not from spears, but from doubt. Darius ruled by fear. Alexander was beginning to rule by vision. The army transformed. As the campaign moved forward, Alexander began to integrate more non-Greeks into his command. He promoted Egyptian engineers, allowed Persian scouts to guide his flanks, and gave roles to local governors who submitted peacefully. He was no longer building an army. He was building a world. Some Macedonians protested. They saw their identity diluted. But Alexander was firm. "If you wish to return home," he said coldly, "then do so. But history will not remember you." Approaching Gaugamela. Finally, scouts returned with news. Darius was encamped near a plain called Gaugamela, east of the Tigris River. The Persian king had chosen the battlefield, wide, open, flat. Perfect for his cavalry. Perfect for his elephants. He wanted a final, decisive clash. Alexander studied the terrain. He did not smile. He did not dread it. He only nodded. "This will be the end," he said. "One way or another." But when he said, "end," it wasn't defeat he imagined. It was transformation. The boy from Macedon. The pharaoh of Egypt. The shadow over Persia. He was coming, not to win, but to become. The morning air was thick with tension. Across the vast plain of Gaugamela, the sun rose over an army the likes of which the world had never seen. Tens of thousands of Persian soldiers, cavalry, and towering war elephants stretched as far as the eye could see. Their banners fluttered in the breeze like a sea of color and fear. On the opposite side stood Alexander's forces, a smaller but fiercely disciplined army. Macedonian phalanxes, Greek hoplites, cavalry units, and allies from across the lands he had conquered. This was not just a battle for territory. It was a battle for the soul of an empire. The stakes. Darius III, the Persian king, was determined to crush this invader once and for all. His lines were vast and well equipped. He had learned from past defeats and marshaled every resource Persia had left. The plain was chosen deliberately, flat and open, ideal for his cavalry and war elephants. Alexander knew this was the greatest challenge he would face. His men, though fewer, were battle-hardened and loyal. But this battle required more than bravery. It required strategy, vision, and a leader who could inspire not just with words, but with action. The formation. Alexander arranged his troops with careful precision. The infantry formed a corps, tightly packed in the phalanx formation. Cavalry units flanked both sides, ready to strike where the enemy was weakest. He kept his elite companion cavalry close, his personal guard, his hammer for breaking enemy lines. The night before, Alexander walked among his soldiers. His words were few but powerful. "Today, we fight not only for conquest but for the future of every land we have touched. Let no man doubt the strength we hold, the cause we serve. Victory is ours, not by chance, but by will." The clash. At dawn, the battle erupted like a storm. Persian cavalry charged, their steeds pounding the earth. War elephants surged forward, their massive forms shaking the ground, trampling all in their path. Arrows rained down like deadly rain. But Alexander was calm. He led the charge on his horse, Bucephalus, cutting through the chaos with practiced skill. The Macedonian phalanx held firm, their long spears repelling enemy assaults. Cavalry on the wings executed precise maneuvers, enveloping enemy units. Alexander's eyes were everywhere, commanding, observing, calculating. He identified weaknesses, directing his forces to exploit gaps. When a flank faltered, he was there to rally, turning potential disaster into opportunity. Turning point. The battle hung in balance when Alexander saw Darius positioned behind his lines, surrounded by guards. With a fierce cry, he led a sudden cavalry charge directly toward the Persian king's position. The enemy lines wavered. The sight of Alexander advancing like a living storm sent shock through the Persian ranks. Fear took root. Darius fled. His army's cohesion shattered. The aftermath. The Persians scattered in disarray. Alexander's forces pursued relentlessly, capturing thousands and seizing vast treasure. But Alexander's focus was not on loot or glory. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, on the empire yet to be unified. Though victorious, the cost was high. Many soldiers lay wounded or dead. The battle had tested every ounce of their strength. Alexander rode through the field, silent for a moment. Then he spoke softly to Ptolemy. "This victory is not the end. It is the beginning of a new world." Legacy of Gaugamela. The Battle of Gaugamela became legend, an example of leadership, courage, and strategy studied for centuries. It marked the collapse of Persian resistance and the rise of Alexander as ruler of an empire stretching from Greece to India. But it also revealed a man transformed, not just a warrior king, but a visionary blending cultures, beliefs, and peoples into a shared destiny. As the sun set over the bloody plains, Alexander knew his greatest challenges lay ahead, not in battle, but in ruling the vast and diverse lands he had won. The aftermath of the Battle of Gaugamela lingered like a distant storm on the horizon. The bloody plain, scattered with fallen soldiers and broken weapons, was now silent except for the whispers of the wind and the solemn footsteps of survivors tending the wounded. Alexander's army, though victorious, was wearied and stretched thin. Yet, beneath the exhaustion, an electric sense of purpose hummed in the air. The great city of Babylon awaited, a prize not of gold or land alone, but of immense symbolic power. As the dust settled, Alexander stood atop a low rise overlooking the expanse. The distant silhouette of Babylon shimmered like a mirage against the bright Mesopotamian sky. Ancient walls wrapped the city like the embrace of time itself, guarding secrets, temples, and treasures passed down through millennia. To Alexander, Babylon was more than a city. It was the heart of a world he sought to unite, the crossroads of cultures, faiths, and histories. The march to Babylon was not a simple military advance. It was a procession toward legitimacy and consolidation. Months of warfare had forged Alexander's reputation as an unbeatable commander, but now the question shifted. Could he rule? Could he transform a conquered land with its own ancient traditions into part of his vision of empire? The journey itself tested the resilience of his troops. The army, composed of Macedonians, Greeks, Persians, Egyptians, and others, trudged through harsh terrain under the relentless Mesopotamian sun. Sand and dust clogged throats. Water was rationed carefully. Yet the soldiers marched on, inspired by their king's quiet confidence and steady presence. Alexander often rode among them, speaking words of encouragement, listening to their worries, reminding them of the prize that awaited. Among the troops, there was an unmistakable shift in mood. The previous battles had been brutal tests of strength and strategy, marked by clashing swords and bloodshed. Now, the air was thick with anticipation and a growing hope. Babylon represented a chance for peace, for rebuilding, for the blending of East and West into a new order. When the army finally arrived at Babylon's gates, the city was alive with cautious curiosity. The people watched from behind towering walls, wary but intrigued by the foreign king who approached not with an army shouting for conquest, but with an air of respect and promise. Alexander understood that to rule Babylon required more than military might. It demanded cultural sensitivity and political wisdom. He immediately sent envoys to meet with the city's elders, priests, and administrators. Alexander spoke to them in a tone that balanced authority with humility. He promised respect for their traditions, temples, and laws. He vowed to maintain the city's prosperity, and to honor its gods alongside his own. Inside the grand palaces and temples, Alexander was greeted not as a conqueror but as a ruler. The Babylonian priests, custodians of arcane knowledge and astronomical wisdom, performed rituals welcoming him as the legitimate successor to the ancient kings. They saw in him not just a foreign invader, but a new pharaoh of the East, a leader who could weave together the diverse threads of empire. For Alexander, the moment was profound. The blending of Greek, Egyptian, and now Babylonian elements into his reign was no accident. It was the deliberate construction of a new identity, one that transcended the boundaries of his Macedonian heritage and embraced the complexity of the lands he governed. Yet the transition was not without challenges. Babylon was a city of immense wealth but also of complex politics. Powerful factions jostled for influence, some loyal to the fallen Persian regime, others eager to align with the new ruler. Alexander navigated these currents with a mix of diplomacy and decisiveness. He appointed trusted generals and local leaders who shared his vision, while suppressing insurrection swiftly but judiciously. Alexander also focused on restoring Babylon's infrastructure. He ordered repairs to the city's ancient canals, ensuring the light-giving waters of the Euphrates flowed freely to nourish fields and sustain its population. Markets reopened under new regulations that encouraged trade and stability. Artists and scholars were invited to the city, fostering a cultural renaissance that blended Greek philosophy with Mesopotamian tradition. One of Alexander's closest companions, Ptolemy, recorded these efforts with admiration. To him, Alexander was not just a conqueror but a builder of civilization. His vision was not limited to battlefield glory. It was about creating a legacy that would endure across generations. During his stay in Babylon, Alexander took the time to study the city's famed libraries and astronomical observatories. He engaged with Babylonian scholars, fascinated by their knowledge of the stars and calendars, comparing it with Greek science. This exchange of ideas further fueled his belief that the empire he was forging required unity not only of lands but of minds. Despite these successes, Alexander was aware that his rule was still fragile. Darius, though defeated, was not yet captured or killed. Persian loyalists remained active in distant provinces. The empire was vast and diverse, a mosaic that could easily fracture without careful stewardship. The king's thoughts often returned to the lessons learned in Egypt, where he had embraced local customs and sought to bridge cultural divides. Babylon was another chapter in that ongoing experiment. To hold this city, he would have to balance force with respect, tradition with innovation. As weeks turned into months, Alexander prepared his army for the next phase of the campaign. But for now, Babylon was his seat of power, a jewel in the crown of an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the edges of India. On a quiet evening, standing atop the city walls, Alexander gazed out over the lit canals and bustling streets below. The stars shone brightly overhead, the same stars that had guided travelers and dreamers for centuries. He whispered to himself, "This is only the beginning." The great city of Babylon now stood as the beating heart of Alexander's vast and ever-expanding empire. His victorious march had brought him to the gates of an ancient civilization, a place where the echoes of countless kings whispered from its temples and palaces. But conquest was only the first step. The real challenge lay in governance, how to transform a patchwork of cultures, languages, and traditions into a cohesive realm under his rule. Alexander understood this intimately. His campaign was not merely about the sword or the battlefield. It was a vision to create something unprecedented, a synthesis of East and West, Macedon and Persia, Greece and Egypt, where loyalties transcended old allegiances and new bonds were forged. Yet the enormity of the task weighed heavily on him. Inside Babylon, the tension was palpable. The city's population was diverse and complex, composed of native Babylonians, Persian officials, Greek settlers, and merchants from across the empire. Many looked at Alexander with a mixture of awe, suspicion, and hope. They had witnessed the fall of Darius and the rise of this new king, but they were uncertain of what his reign would bring. One of Alexander's first decisions was to retain many of the existing Persian administrators and satraps. This pragmatic move aimed to preserve stability and ensure the smooth operation of the empire's far-flung provinces. However, it also stirred unease among some of his Macedonian officers who feared dilution of their authority. Alexander met this challenge head-on. In councils and private meetings, he urged unity and loyalty above ethnic divisions. "We are not conquerors," he proclaimed, "but heirs to a common destiny. The future belongs to those who embrace it, not those who cling to the past." To demonstrate his commitment to cultural integration, Alexander adopted several Persian customs. He wore Persian robes and participated in royal ceremonies that honored the traditions of his new subjects. This decision shocked many of his Greek and Macedonian followers, who saw it as a betrayal of their heritage. Yet Alexander remained steadfast. "It is not our blood alone that defines us," he told his companions. "It is our actions, our vision, and our respect for those we govern." Despite these efforts, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Some Persian nobles resented the presence of Macedonian soldiers and advisors in their cities. Local populations, wary of foreign rule, occasionally erupted into unrest. Alexander's challenge was to balance firmness with diplomacy, punishment with forgiveness. He personally traveled across the empire, visiting key cities and provinces. Wherever he went, he sought to understand local customs, meet with leaders, and address grievances. His presence inspired loyalty, but also reminded subjects of his authority. He knew that leadership required both presence and patience. In one notable instance, a rebellion broke out in a city near the eastern provinces. Alexander led a swift campaign to quell the uprising but afterward extended clemency to the local leaders, incorporating them into his administration. This combination of strength and mercy became a hallmark of his rule. Meanwhile, Alexander continued to encourage the exchange of ideas and culture. Greek scholars mingled with Babylonian priests. Egyptian architects collaborated with Persian builders. This blending of knowledge fostered innovations in astronomy, engineering, and governance. Alexander envisioned an empire not just unified by force but enriched by diversity. However, ruling such a vast territory was not without logistical challenges. Communication across thousands of miles was slow and difficult. Alexander established an efficient system of messengers and governors to maintain control. He also implemented new laws to standardize trade and taxation, ensuring the empire's economic stability. Amid these responsibilities, Alexander remained a soldier at heart. He continued to train with his troops, lead military exercises, and prepare for campaigns to secure the empire's borders. His restless energy and vision drove him forward, even as fatigue and the burden of empire began to show. In private moments, he confided to trusted friends about his fears and hopes. He worried about the fragility of his empire, the possibility of betrayal, and the legacy he would leave behind. But he also dreamed of a world where East and West were no longer enemies but partners in progress. As months passed, Alexander's rule in Babylon and beyond solidified. His combination of military prowess, political acumen, and cultural sensitivity earned him the loyalty of many but also the enmity of a few. The path ahead remained uncertain, filled with both promise and peril. One evening, Standing atop the palace balcony, Alexander gazed at the sprawling city below. The lights flickered like stars, and the Euphrates River glistened in the moonlight. The empire he had forged was vast and complex, but it was alive, breathing, evolving, and waiting for its next chapter. He whispered softly, "To rule is to build a world. To build a world is to dream beyond borders." After months of solidifying his control over Babylon and its surrounding territories, Alexander the Great prepared for a new chapter in his grand campaign, an expedition eastward, beyond the known borders of Persia, into the vast and mysterious lands of Central Asia and India. This next phase would test not only his military prowess but also his ability to adapt and lead amid unfamiliar cultures and relentless challenges. The army gathered, rested but restless. Supplies were stocked, strategies revised, and scouts sent ahead to map the unknown terrain. Soldiers whispered about the fabled riches and strange peoples that awaited them beyond the great mountains and deserts. For many, this journey was a daunting prospect, far removed from the familiar cities of Greece, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. Alexander himself viewed this expedition with a complex mix of anticipation and caution. The victories at Gaugamela and the conquest of Babylon had secured his reputation as the undisputed ruler of Persia, but now he faced an entirely different kind of warfare and diplomacy. The eastern lands were home to tribes and kingdoms unlike any he had encountered, diverse, fiercely independent, and often elusive. Setting out from Babylon, the army traversed challenging landscapes. The burning deserts gave way to rugged mountain passes, where cold winds howled and paths narrowed dangerously. Every step forward was a struggle against nature itself. Yet Alexander's leadership shone brightest in adversity. He encouraged his men, leading from the front, sharing in their hardships. As they advanced, the Macedonian forces encountered new peoples and cultures. From the Sogdians to the Bactrians, local rulers met Alexander with cautious curiosity, often wary of the famous conqueror but sometimes willing to negotiate alliances. Alexander employed a blend of diplomacy and strategic force, winning some through friendship and others through decisive battle. One of the most formidable challenges came in the region of Bactria, where rugged terrain and fierce tribes made control difficult. Alexander spent months campaigning there, enduring ambushes and guerrilla tactics that tested his tactical flexibility. Yet he was undeterred. Each victory in these wild lands was a testament to his determination and adaptability. Throughout this expedition, Alexander also sought to integrate local customs and traditions. He married Roxana, a noblewoman from Bactria, symbolizing his commitment to blending cultures and legitimizing his rule. This union was both personal and political, reflecting his evolving vision of empire. The journey eastward was marked by extraordinary moments of cultural exchange. Alexander's officers documented new languages, religions, and customs. Greek philosophers and scientists traveled with the army, eager to learn from these distant lands. The empire was no longer a simple conquest, but a living mosaic of human experience. Yet the expedition was not without hardship. The army faced supply shortages, harsh climates, and occasional dissent among the ranks. Some soldiers longed for home, weary of endless marching and battles. Alexander addressed these concerns with understanding but firmness, reminding his men of the glory and purpose that lay ahead. As the forces approached the Indus River, the gateway to India, anticipation surged. The tales of vast armies and powerful kings stirred both excitement and anxiety. Alexander knew the battles to come would be some of the most challenging of his career. Standing on the banks of the Indus, Alexander paused to reflect on the journey thus far. From the shores of the Mediterranean to the deserts and mountains of Central Asia, his campaign had transformed him from a Macedonian prince into a world ruler. The path ahead was uncertain, but his resolve was unwavering. he addressed his commanders. "We stand at the edge of the known world. Beyond lies the land of legends, a place where history will be written by our deeds. Let us march forward with courage and wisdom." With that, the great expedition pressed onward, stepping into the next chapter of an extraordinary saga, one that would reshape the ancient world forever. As Alexander's forces crossed into the lush and unfamiliar lands beyond the Indus River, a new and formidable challenge awaited, a battle that would test every ounce of his military genius and the loyalty of his troops. The Battle of the Hydaspes, fought against King Porus, was not just a clash of armies but a meeting of worlds, cultures, and wills. The Hydaspes River, swollen with monsoon rains, carved a wide, turbulent path through the green plains. On the opposite bank stood King Porus, a warrior famed for his courage and skill, commanding a well-trained army equipped with towering war elephants and seasoned cavalry. Porus was a symbol of resistance and strength, determined to defend his kingdom against the Macedonian invaders. For weeks, Alexander's army camped on the western bank, observing the enemy and searching for a way to cross the river. The challenge was immense. The monsoon rains had transformed the landscape into a muddy quagmire, and Porus's forces were well positioned to repel any attempted crossing. The Macedonian troops were anxious but inspired by their king's unwavering confidence. Alexander's plan was audacious. He chose to lead a covert night crossing upstream, away from Porus's gaze. Under the cover of darkness and a heavy storm, the troops quietly crossed the raging river, fighting the strong current and treacherous banks. The risk was enormous. Failure would mean disaster and the loss of men and morale. But Alexander's leadership shone brightest in this desperate hour. His presence on the front lines, his calm demeanor, and his unyielding resolve rallied the soldiers. They pushed through exhaustion and fear, emerging on the eastern bank ready to engage. The battle that followed was fierce and brutal. Porus's elephants charged like living fortresses, causing chaos among the Macedonian ranks. The ground shook with their thunderous steps, and the air was thick with dust and the cries of combatants. Yet Alexander's troops, trained and disciplined, adapted quickly. Using clever tactics, Alexander ordered his archers and light infantry to target the elephants' vulnerable sides and eyes. Cavalry units executed flanking maneuvers, disrupting Porus's formations. The fight was a test of endurance and strategy, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. In the midst of the chaos, Alexander sought out King Porus himself. The two leaders met on the battlefield, warriors locked in a duel that symbolized the clashing worlds they represented. Though Porus fought valiantly, Alexander's superior tactics and the morale of his troops turned the tide. After hours of relentless combat, Porus's forces began to falter. Recognizing the bravery of his opponent, Alexander granted Porus clemency, allowing him to retain his kingdom as a loyal ally. This act of magnanimity won the respect of both his men and the local populations, cementing Alexander's reputation as a just and visionary ruler. The victory at the Hydaspes was monumental. It marked the easternmost expansion of Alexander's empire and showcased his ability to lead diverse forces against daunting odds. But the battle also foreshadowed the limits of conquest. The long and exhausting campaigns had begun to wear on the soldiers' spirits. In the aftermath, Alexander addressed his weary troops. He praised their courage and endurance but also sensed their growing desire for rest and home. Yet his vision pushed him onward, toward new lands and challenges. The Battle of the Hydaspes remains one of the most celebrated in military history, not only for its strategic brilliance, but for its human drama. It was a moment when cultures met, clashed, and ultimately found a fragile harmony under the banner of Alexander's empire. As the sun set over the battlefield, casting long shadows over the wounded and victorious alike, Alexander stood silently. He understood that every conquest was also a beginning, a new challenge to govern, to integrate, and to inspire. The journey eastward was far from over, but this victory was a testament to the king's enduring spirit and the unbreakable bond between leader and army. The victory at the Hydaspes River marked a monumental achievement in Alexander's campaign. Yet as the dust settled and the Macedonian army regrouped, a subtle but powerful shift began to take hold within the ranks. The men who had followed their king across thousands of miles of hostile terrain and fought in countless battles were beginning to question the endless march eastward. The grandeur of conquest clashed with the harsh realities of war and exile from their homes. In the days following the battle, Alexander's officers observed the mood of the troops closely. Though still disciplined, murmurs of fatigue and homesickness grew louder. The soldiers, once inspired by the promise of glory and riches, now faced the brutal truth of a seemingly unending campaign. The lands ahead were unknown, the enemies fierce, and the prospects uncertain. Alexander himself sensed this shift. The bond he had forged with his men through shared hardship and victory was beginning to strain. His vision of a united empire stretching from Greece to the far reaches of India was magnificent, but it required not just military success, but also the unwavering commitment of his followers. One evening, as the campfires flickered and the soldiers rested, Alexander convened a council with his closest commanders. The discussion was tense but honest. Some urged a halt to further eastern expansion, advocating instead for consolidation of the territories already won. Others pressed to continue, driven by ambition and the desire to push boundaries. Alexander weighed their counsel carefully. He understood the need to respect his men's limits while pursuing his destiny. In a bold move, he agreed to pause the advance and allow the army to rest and recuperate. This decision was met with relief among the troops and reaffirmed the leader's empathy and wisdom. Despite this respite, the challenges of governing a sprawling and diverse empire remained daunting. Alexander's attempts to blend cultures through marriage alliances, adoption of local customs, and promotion of cultural exchange were revolutionary but also controversial. Some Macedonian soldiers resisted these changes, clinging to their traditional identities and resenting the growing influence of foreign customs. Tensions occasionally flared, but Alexander's charismatic leadership helped to maintain order. He continued to lead by example, participating in local rituals and encouraging his officers to respect the customs of conquered peoples. This approach fostered loyalty among many but also created rifts within the ranks. Meanwhile, the logistical difficulties of sustaining such a vast army in distant lands became more pronounced. Supply lines stretched thin, and communication delays complicated coordination. Alexander invested heavily in infrastructure, building roads and establishing supply depots, but the sheer scale of the empire tested even his remarkable administrative skills. Amid these pressures, Alexander remained restless. His mind raced with plans for further campaigns, to the south, into the mysterious lands of the Indian subcontinent, and perhaps beyond. Yet he was increasingly aware that the true test of his legacy would not be just conquests but the lasting unity and prosperity of the empire he envisioned. In quiet moments, Alexander reflected on the cost of his ambitions, the lives lost, the families separated, the burdens borne by his people. He also recognized the growing weariness in his own heart. The relentless pace of war and rule weighed heavily on him, but he was driven by a vision of greatness that transcended personal sacrifice. The soldiers, for their part, found strength in camaraderie and shared purpose. They told stories of past battles, celebrated victories, and dreamed of returning home as heroes. Some began to embrace the new cultural blend Alexander fostered, seeing in it a chance for a better world. Others remained skeptical, longing for the familiar comforts of Macedon and Greece. As winter approached, the army established winter quarters along the industry. Here, the men rested, trained, and prepared for the campaigns to come. Alexander used this time to consolidate his administration, meet with local leaders, and plan future expeditions. The pause also allowed reflection on the nature of empire. Alexander's conquests had reshaped the ancient world, bringing East and West into unprecedented contact. The fusion of cultures, ideas, and peoples created new possibilities but also new tensions. The path forward required wisdom, patience, and a vision that could unite diversity without suppressing it. In the midst of these complexities, Alexander remained a figure of inspiration and determination. His presence lifted the spirits of his followers and challenged them to believe in a destiny beyond their individual lives. The bond between king and army was forged not just in battle but in shared dreams and sacrifices. The Battle of the Hydaspes had been a turning point, a moment of triumph and transition. It marked the edge of known conquest but also the beginning of a new challenge, to build an enduring empire from the fragments of the ancient world. As the sun set over the distant mountains, casting long shadows over the camp, Alexander stood among his men, a visionary leader at a crossroads. The journey ahead was uncertain, but the legacy he sought to create burned bright in his heart. "We have come far," he said quietly, "but the true battle is for the future, not just of lands, but of peoples and ideas. Together we must forge a world worthy of our sacrifice." The soldiers listened, their resolve renewed. Though the road was long and fraught with uncertainty, their loyalty to Alexander and his dream remained unbroken. The empire's fate, and history itself, hung in the balance. After years of relentless campaigning, after conquering vast territories and crossing formidable natural barriers, Alexander the Great faced the greatest challenge of his career, not from foreign armies, but from within his own ranks. The soldiers who had followed him from Macedonia, through deserts and mountains, across rivers and plains, were growing weary, restless, and disillusioned. The decision to push further eastward, into lands unknown and hostile, had been met with both awe and anxiety. While Alexander's vision was grand, promising glory beyond imagination, his men bore the heavy cost. Endless marches, brutal battles, harsh climates, and unfamiliar customs had eroded their initial enthusiasm. Many longed for home, for the familiar skies of Greece and the comfort of family and hearth. As the army prepared to return westward, rumors spread through the ranks. Whispers of mutiny grew louder. The long-suffering soldiers questioned the wisdom of continuing on a campaign with no clear end. Their loyalty, once unshakable, began to waver under the weight of exhaustion and uncertainty. The moment of truth came at the Hyphasis River, the easternmost point reached by Alexander's forces. Here, confronted by the vastness of the Indian subcontinent and the daunting prospect of further conquest, the army refused to advance. The mutiny was not born of rebellion against Alexander himself, but of a collective will to survive and return home. Alexander was stunned but not defeated. He understood the limits of human endurance and the importance of his men's welfare. With a heavy heart, he agreed to turn back, acknowledging that even the greatest ambition must yield to reality. The return journey was arduous but marked by a sense of relief and reflection. The soldiers marched home, bearing scars of battle and memories of lands forever changed. Alexander's leadership remained steadfast, but the empire he had forged was now faced with the challenge of sustaining unity without continual conquest. Along the way, Alexander continued to promote cultural integration, establishing cities and encouraging the blending of Greek and local customs. These efforts laid the groundwork for the Hellenistic world, a legacy of exchange and innovation born from his conquests. Yet the return was bittersweet. The soldiers' revolt had exposed the fragility of even the most disciplined army, and the limits of conquest as a path to immortality. Alexander's dreams of endless expansion gave way to the task of governing a vast and diverse empire, demanding diplomacy, vision, and resilience. The mutiny at the Hyphasis River stands as a poignant moment in history, when the march of empire met the human heart. It reminds us that greatness is not measured solely by territory gain but by the understanding of limits and the courage to adapt. As the Macedonian army retraced its steps, Alexander's resolve remained unbroken. He was no longer just a conqueror but a ruler tasked with shaping a new world from the fragments of the old. The journey home was not an end but a beginning, a chance to build an enduring legacy that would echo through the ages. As the sun set on Alexander the Great's extraordinary journey, the vast empire he had carved from the ancient world stood as a testament to his ambition, vision, and indomitable spirit. But beyond the battles won and lands conquered, the true measure of his legacy would lie in the cultural fusion, the shifting tides of power, and the stories passed down through generations. Alexander's return from the easternmost reaches of his empire marked both an end and a beginning. His army, weary yet loyal, had witnessed wonders and horrors, triumphs and trials, that few could ever imagine. The march back was a time of reflection, not just for the soldiers but for Alexander himself. He contemplated the cost of conquest, the lives lost, the families torn apart, the toll on body and soul. Yet he also recognized the seeds of a new era sown through his campaigns, the blending of Greek and Eastern cultures, the spread of ideas, languages, and customs that would shape civilizations for centuries. Cities founded by Alexander became centers of learning and exchange. Greek art, science, and philosophy mingled with local traditions, creating a vibrant Hellenistic world. This cultural renaissance transcended borders and empires, inspiring future generations to dream beyond their origins. Alexander's leadership style, his willingness to adopt foreign customs, his respect for local rulers, and his vision of unity, challenged the norms of his time. He was not merely a conqueror but a pioneer of globalization in the ancient world, setting a precedent for rulers to come. Yet, the campaign also exposed the limits of power. The mutiny of his soldiers, the difficulties of governance, and the eventual fragmentation of his empire after his death revealed the fragile nature of empires built on conquest alone. The dream of a united world under one ruler remained elusive, but the foundation had been laid. In the years that followed, Alexander's story became legend, told and retold in countless forms. From historians and poets to filmmakers and artists, his life inspired awe and debate. Was he a hero or a tyrant? A visionary or a ruthless conqueror? The complexity of his character ensures that the discussion continues to this day. For those who marched with him, Alexander was a leader who demanded the impossible and achieved the extraordinary. For the conquered peoples, he was both a liberator and an invader. His legacy is a mosaic of triumph and tragedy, of dreams realized and costs paid. As we look back on this epic journey, we see more than a sequence of battles and campaigns. We see the human story of ambition, courage, resilience, and the quest for meaning in a world forever changed by one man's vision. Alexander's empire may have fragmented, but his influence endured, shaping history, culture, and the imagination of humanity. His story reminds us that the greatest conquests are not just of land but of ideas, hearts, and the enduring spirit of exploration. And so, the memory of Alexander the Great marches on, an eternal figure standing at the crossroads of history, inspiring all who dare to dream beyond the horizon.